In speaking to a larger audience of the most important questions of our time, much will depend on whether or not we know something of the deeper powers at work in world historical developments, or, in other words, of the science of initiation, as we may call it. Nowadays, it is relatively easy to discuss contemporary issues based on all kinds of outward knowledge that one may consider to be scientific and practically useful. But it is extremely difficult to speak of these questions today once one knows something about this science of initiation and bases upon it, as one must, everything that we discuss on such occasions as this. Someone who addresses contemporary issues from the point of view of initiation science will be aware that he is opposed not only by the subjective opinions of most of those to whom he is speaking, but that a large portion of humanity today is in one way or another also subject to the very powerful and ever-growing influence of Ahrimanic forces at work in the world. However, I can only explain what I mean by this by offering you first a kind of historical overview of a large span of human history. From diverse reflections we have engaged in together here, and from various published lecture cycles, you will know that the middle of the 15th century marks the beginning of our current era as modern human beings. We have always referred to this period, starting around the mid-15th century, which is still basically in its infancy, as the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. It succeeded the previous era, which we reckon from the middle of the 8th century BC up to the middle of the 15th century. Looking still further back, we come to the Egyptian Chaldean epoch. I mention this in passing, only to remind you of the larger context of our modern developments as we experience them. Now, as you know, the mystery of Golgotha occurred after the first third of the Greco-Roman epoch. We have described from many different perspectives what occurred through this mystery of Golgotha, and what significance it had for all human evolution, and in fact for the whole evolution of the earth. Today I want to connect certain things relating to this mystery of Golgotha to this broader historical context. To do so, let us look back to much more ancient times, let us say to around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. As you know, outward historical records have very little to say about this early evolution of the human race on Earth. External documents point us to the Orient, to Asia. And from various anthroposophic reflections, you will know that the further back we look in humanity's evolution, the more different we find the human psyche, and that, in a sense, we find an ancient primordial wisdom underlying all human evolution at that time. You know that traditional wisdom was preserved within small secret circles until the 19th century, and then, albeit with little correspondence to the primordial wisdom of ancient traditions, until our own day. People today who become acquainted with one or another aspect of this ancient primordial wisdom of humanity are astonished at the depths of reality to which it points. At the same time, you will have seen from our reflections over the years that these widespread teachings of ancient times contrast radically with the outlooks of the ancient Hebrew peoples, the Jewish people, which are quite different in character. In a sense, therefore, it is valid to say that the former widespread primordial teachings are a heathen element contrasting with Hebrew and Jewish teachings. As you know from extant historical records and documents, the Christian element subsequently emerged from this Jewish tradition. From these historical facts, you can see something that I wish to consider today, that in the course of human evolution, it became necessary to oppose an ancient heathen element and its primordial wisdom with the Jewish element, from which Christianity, at least partly, later developed. In other words, this ancient heathen wisdom was not granted sole influence over humanity's further evolution. And this will lead us to ask why it was that this ancient primordial heathen wisdom, which in many respects can elicit our wonder, had to acquire a new shape, had to be transformed through Judaism and Christianity. This is a question we need to ask, but for initiation wisdom, it can be answered only by a very, very important fact, an occurrence in the Far East at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. Looking back to these times in inward vision, the seer discovers there, too, the human incarnation of a supersensible being, like the incarnation of a supersensible being occurring through the mystery of Golgotha, when Christ entered the human being Jesus of Nazareth. The incarnation that occurred at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC is extremely hard to perceive, even with the spiritual scientific vision made possible by initiation science. It endowed humankind with something extraordinarily luminous, extraordinarily incisive, basically that ancient primordial wisdom which I referred to. From an initially outward perspective, one can say that this influx of wisdom, deeply penetrating reality, was cold, intellectual, little colored by a content of feeling or sensibility. But that is an external appraisal. We can only inwardly judge the nature of this wisdom if we look back to the incarnation that occurred in the Far East, in Asia, at the start of the 3rd millennium BC. Here, we discover by clairvoyant vision that the power of Lucifer did truly incarnate into humanity, and that this incarnation, accomplished in a certain way, gave rise to a primordial wisdom that spread amongst human culture in the 3rd post-Atlantean epoch. What this Asiatic and Luciferic cultural impulse spread amongst humanity worked on into the ancient Greek era, a Luciferic wisdom that was certainly of benefit to humankind at that phase of evolution, and was in some ways illustrious. It manifests in a range of nuances, depending on the different peoples and races amongst whom it spread, clearly discernible throughout Asia and still apparent in Egyptian and Babylonian culture, but, as I said, also underlying the foundations of Greek culture. Everything that human beings could think, compose, and will at the time was in a sense determined by this Luciferic impetus in human culture. It would, of course, be extremely narrow-minded to say that since this was an incarnation of Lucifer, we should want nothing to do with it. Such Philistinism would lead us to flee all kinds of things of great beauty and grandeur that emerged in humanity from this Lucifer stream. As stated, the ideal of Greek beauty also arose from this developmental stream. At the time the mystery of Golgotha unfolded, all Gnostic thinking and knowledge then existing was a penetrating wisdom that profoundly illumined the world and drew on the impulse of Luciferic powers. We cannot therefore say that this Gnostic thinking was misguided. To say it was imbued with Luciferic impulses is merely to characterize it. Now, 2 millennia and a good deal more after this incarnation of Lucifer came the mystery of Golgotha. And we can say that the thinking, feeling, and sensibilities of those amongst whom the impulse of the mystery of Golgotha spread were still fully endowed with the quality of this Luciferic impulse. But now, a very different quality of impulse arose, that of Christ, and entered the evolutionary stream of civilization. We have spoken of its significance within humanity. Today I will just say in passing that the Christ impulse was absorbed by sensibilities of the kind I described. We can put it like this. The Christ impulse shone its light into the best of Lucifer's endowments to humanity. In the early Christian centuries, the Christ impulse was absorbed. The Christ was understood by virtue of what humankind had received from Lucifer. We have to be open-minded about these things. Otherwise, we will never properly understand the distinctive way in which the Christ impulse was absorbed in these early centuries. As the Luciferic impulse increasingly faded from human sensibility, people grew ever less capable of fully absorbing the true nature of the Christ impulse. You need only consider the increasing materialism that prevailed as the modern era advanced. But if you ask what became most materialistic of all, you have to acknowledge that it was modern Christian theology. You see, a great part of modern Christian theology testifies to the greatest materialism. It no longer sees the Christ living in the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, but refers to him as, quote, the simple man of Nazareth, close quote, a figure more easily understood. The more people accepted the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, as an ordinary mortal, albeit one amongst the ranks of other renowned historical individuals, the more this pleased a certain materialistic school of modern theology, which wishes to have very little indeed to do with the supersensible nature of the Golgotha event. The Luciferic influx into human sensibility gradually faded in the human soul, making way increasingly for what we call the Ahrimanic impulse, which will grow ever stronger in the near and also the further future. The Ahrimanic impulse derives from beings other than Christ or Lucifer, yet it is also a supersensible influx, and we could say a supersensible being, there is little distinction, whose influence will become especially powerful, ever more and more so, in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. If we consider the turbulence of recent years, we will find that it has been caused in particular by Ahrimanic powers. Like the incarnation of Lucifer at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, and the Christ incarnation at the time of the mystery of Golgotha, there will be an incarnation in the West of the being of Ahriman in the 3rd millennium AD, sometime after our current life on earth has ended. We only properly comprehend the course of history and human evolution over almost 6 millennia if we see it in these terms: a Luciferic incarnation at one pole, the Christ incarnation in the middle of this period, and the incarnation of Ahriman at the other pole. Lucifer is the power in us which stirs up all quixotic and fervent powers, all false mysticism, all that seeks to elevate us arrogantly beyond our actual capacities. In a sense, it brings our blood into chaotic disorder in order to lift us out of ourselves. Ahriman, on the other hand, is the power that makes a person prosaic, hard-headed, Philistine, that ossifies us and persuades us of the illusory truth of materialism. Basically, our human nature is the effort to maintain equilibrium between the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic power. And in modern times, the Christ impulse aids us in creating this balance or equilibrium. These two poles are always present in us, the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic. But in historical terms, we find that the Luciferic impulse predominated in certain streams of cultural evolution in the pre-Christian period and through into the early Christian centuries, whereas Ahriman has been active since the mid-15th century and is growing ever stronger until eventually an actual incarnation of Ahriman will occur within Western humanity. Now, it is intrinsic to such things that they are long prepared beforehand. Just as Lucifer once appeared in human form in China, and Christ Jesus appeared in human form in the Near East, so Ahrimanic powers are preparing human evolution in a way that will allow humanity to succumb to Ahriman when he eventually appears in human form in Western civilization, which will scarcely any longer be civilization as we know it. There is no use entertaining illusions about such things. Ahriman will appear in human form. All that will matter is the degree to which he finds humankind prepared for his arrival, whether his preparations will enable him to enlist all humanity, all civilization as we know it, to follow his dictates, or whether he will find a humanity that can offer him resistance. Illusions are of no help here. Nowadays people try to evade the truth, and one cannot present it to them plain and unvarnished, because they would mock and ridicule such ideas. But nor can one present such things to them as I tried to do now in the form of the threefold social organism. The majority of them, at least, do not wish to hear about this either. In fact, this refusal to countenance such things is one of the means that Ahrimanic powers can employ to ensure that when Ahriman appears in human form, he will have the greatest possible number of adherents on earth. This refusal to engage with the most important truths will pave the way for Ahriman to thrive in his incarnation. You see, in seeking the right stance toward what will unfold in human evolution through Ahriman, nothing will help except an open-minded perception of the powers which Ahriman employs to act upon us, as well as the powers that can arm humanity against the temptations and ensnarements of Ahrimanic powers. Today, therefore, let us cast a look, at least, from various perspectives, on the kinds of things that would consolidate people's adherence to Ahriman, and which now especially the Ahrimanic powers are sending down from supersensible worlds, sending also through human sensibilities, in order to secure as great a following as possible. One such means is to obstruct people's understanding of the importance for the human being of certain prevalent types of thinking. You know that there was a huge difference between the way a person felt in relation to the whole cosmos in, say, Egyptian times, and still in Greek times, and how he felt at the beginning of the modern era, after the medieval period had ended. If you imagine an ancient Egyptian fully versed in these things, he would have known that he is not only bodily constituted of substances found here on earth, manifest in the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms, but that his being was informed by an influx of powers that he saw above in the stars. He felt himself to be part of the whole cosmos. He felt the whole cosmos to be not only animate, but also ensouled and spiritualized. And in his awareness there lived something of the spiritual entelechy of the cosmos, the soul nature of the cosmos, the life of the cosmos. All this was lost in the course of modern human history. Today the human being gazes up from his earth to the starry world, where he sees planets, stars, suns, comets, and so forth. But what means does he use to observe everything he sees up there in the cosmos, all that gazes down upon him? He uses mathematics. and at most also mechanical laws. Everything that encompasses the earth is now void of spirit, soul, and even life for him. The cosmos is now seen really as a great mechanical construct that can only be understood with the aid of mathematical and mechanical laws. Employing these laws, we understand it wonderfully well. This is not to say that a spiritual scientist will not fully value the achievements of Galileo, Kepler, and others. But what enters human comprehension and human awareness through the teachings of these great figures reveals the universe to be nothing but a vast mechanism. What this means for our view of reality can be seen only by someone able to trace the full scope of human nature. Astronomers and astrophysicists posit the universe as a mechanism that can be comprehended and calculated through mathematical formula, and a worldview such as this is one people can certainly credit from the moment they wake up in the morning to when they fall asleep again at night. But in the unconscious depths, people do not reach with their waking consciousness, but which belong to their existence nevertheless, and in which they live during sleep, a quite different sense of things, a different comprehension of the universe flows into the human soul. A knowledge then lives within us that we are not consciously aware of, but that lives below in the depths of our soul and configures it. A knowledge of the spirit, of the life of the soul, of the life of the cosmos. And while people are unaware in their waking consciousness of what occurs in them, in community with the spirit, soul, and life of the universe, from the time they fall asleep to the moment they wake up, these things nevertheless live in the soul. Much of the split in modern human beings is caused by the disharmony between the soul's experience of the universe during sleep and its avowed view of the universe in waking awareness. The whole spirit and import of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science tells you that while Galileo and Copernicus introduced into humanity a view of the universe that is grandiose and mighty, this is not an absolute truth, but just one aspect of the cosmos, one way of looking at it. It is arrogant of modern humankind to say that the Ptolemaic system is childish, that people thought like this when humanity was still in its infancy. The idea that we have now attained some kind of absolute truth through our, quote, glorious advancements, close quote, is mistaken. This worldview is no more absolute than the Ptolemaic system was, just one perspective. Anthroposophically oriented spiritual science can teach us that mere cosmic mathematics, all schemata of a mechanical nature, do not provide us with an absolute truth, but give us illusions about the cosmos. This is not to say that we do not need these illusions. They are intrinsic to the particular evolutionary stage we are passing through, and educative for us, as other views were intrinsic to other stages and educative. We have to appropriate them, but we must also know that they are illusory. And they become even more illusory when we carry them on into our everyday surroundings in atomistic teachings about matter, finding a kind of small-scale astronomy in molecular theory, in the nature of the Earth's substances. A true perspective on modern science, wherever it posits such things, will recognize that this is all founded on illusion. Ahriman, hoping that his incarnation will be as fruitful as possible for him, is most keenly interested in human beings perfecting this illusory science, which more or less accounts for all science today, but without them realizing that it is illusory. Ahriman has the very greatest interest in teaching people mathematics, but without them seeing that mathematical and mechanical views of the cosmos are mere illusion. He has the very greatest interest in teaching humanity chemistry, physics, biology, and so forth, which figure in our culture as greatly admired disciplines, but to make us believe, too, that they embody absolute truths rather than partial aspects. Photographs, if you like, from only one viewpoint. If you photograph a tree from one side only, it will give you a true, yet only a partial image. A fuller picture will emerge if you photograph it from 4 sides. Ahriman has the profoundest interest in concealing from humanity the fact that modern intellectual and rationalist science, with its credo of empiricism, is a great illusion. He would secure supreme, triumphant success if he could succeed in perpetuating into the 3rd millennium these scientific superstitions so prevalent everywhere today, which even dictate the terms of social science. Born, then, as a human being, he would rejoice to find these scientific superstitions living within Western civilization. But do not draw the wrong conclusions from what I have now said. It would be mistaken to simply avoid and evade modern science. That would be the most misguided thing you could do. We should fully acquaint ourselves with it, but with full awareness that it offers us an illusory aspect, albeit necessary and educative for us at this stage of our evolution. We do not defend ourselves against Ahriman by avoiding modern science, but rather by acquainting ourselves with its true form and nature. This science inevitably gives us an outward illusion about the cosmos, and we need this. Please do not think that we do not need this outward illusion. But from a quite different angle and perspective, through spiritual research, we must fill it with true reality, advancing from its illusory character to the real truth. Numerous lecture cycles I have given emphasize what I am saying again today. I have always tried to engage fully with modern science, yet, at the same time, to lift it higher into the realm where we can perceive the extent to which it holds true. To wish away modern science is rather like wishing away a rainbow just because it is an illusion of light and color. To understand it fully, you will first have to comprehend its illusory character, and the same is true of all the ideas and concepts of the world which modern science offers. It offers only illusions, and we must see through them. By the very fact of penetrating these illusions, we educate ourselves to comprehend the world's reality. Keeping humankind locked in its scientific superstitions is one of the means employed by Ahriman to make his incarnation as effective as possible. The other means, a second means, is to encourage everything that divides people today, sunders them into small cliques and groupings at odds with one another. In the political arena, we can see this clearly today in all the parties and factions. If we study this phenomenon with an open mind, we can see that these parties feuding with each other cannot be explained by mere differences in human nature. You can't explain the Great War by referring to human disharmonies between different types of person, or differences of nation and race. Here it is very clear that non-sensory powers, Ahrimanic powers, have been exerting their influence. And these Ahrimanic powers are at work wherever disharmonies between groups of people arise. Let us take a very characteristic example to show what most of these things are based upon. Our modern proletariat now looks to Karl Marx. It is worth studying how the teachings of Karl Marx spread amongst the modern proletariat, and how they gave rise to a never-ending flood of Marxist literature. This literature fully embraces the scientific mode. everything is rigorously supported with proof and evidence. So rigorously, in fact, that many one would have thought immune to Marxism have in fact succumbed to it. The fate of Marxism was to spread, first of all, through the proletariat, while academic institutions disputed and rejected it. Now there are a number of academics who can no longer resist the logic of Marxism, who acknowledge it and can no longer escape it, because Marxist literature, as has gradually become apparent, offers subtly congruent conclusions. With a modern scientific outlook and mode of thinking, the propositions of Marxism can be very nicely proven. The middle classes did not have their own Karl Marx to prove the opposite, but it would have been possible. You see, just as one can prove the ideological character of law and ethics, etc., and the theory of added value, and axioms of materialistic history from a Marxist perspective, so one could equally well prove exactly the opposite about all such things. It would be perfectly possible for a bourgeois Marx to prove exactly the opposite in the same rigorous way, without any distortion or underhand aims. Such evidence would certainly stand up. And this is because modern human thinking, the modern intellect, lies in a stratum of our being that prevents it reaching down to access realities. This is why one can prove one thing and then its opposite equally well, both with an equally rigorous procedure. Today it is possible with equally valid logic to prove the truth of spiritualism on the one hand and materialism on the other. These conflicting perspectives can feud with each other with equal right, because modern intellectualism lives in an upper stratum of reality and does not plumb the depths of existence. The same applies to partisan viewpoints of all kinds. If we do not comprehend this, but simply absorb such things through our upbringing, family, through the particular conditions we live in, and the politics of the day, we may honestly believe our partisan view to be well-founded, and yet we have just fallen or slipped into it, and find ourselves in conflict with people who have likewise slipped into their own partisan position. Both positions will be equally valid, and this brings chaos and confusion over humanity. The convulsions it causes will continually increase if humanity does not come to see this. And this confusion is something that Ahrimanic powers employ, again, to prepare their triumphant incarnation, driving humankind ever more strongly into something it finds so difficult to comprehend. That one thing and its very opposite can be equally proven with the same well-founded intellectual or scientific reasoning. We have to recognize that anything can be proven, and it is in this light that we should see the proofs hammered out in modern academic discourse. Only in a science, in the strict meaning of the word, the strict study of phenomena, can realities become apparent. But in no other field should one allow merely intellectual proofs to hold sway. Human knowledge and perception must be sought at a deeper level, as in the practice of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science, than in the stratum of our being where evidence and proof originates. And only then can we avoid the danger of succumbing to the Ahrimanic temptation that increasingly drags us down into these things. In our era, Ahriman also uses everything founded on genetics and inheritance to sow confusion and discord, although we have really grown beyond this now in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. The Ahrimanic power employs all that originates in heredity to set groups of human beings at odds with each other. Everything based on differences of family, race, and nation is used by the Ahrimanic powers to sow discord. It is a fine thing to preach freedom for every race and nation, even the smallest, but adversarial powers always employ fine words to sow confusion and to achieve the things that Ahriman wishes to for his incarnation. Who is it who incites nation against nation and invokes the kinds of issues that dominate humanity today? It is Ahriman, the Ahrimanic seduction influencing people. People are so easily deceived in this domain. They do not wish to descend to the deeper strata where realities exist. Ahriman is ably preparing for his aims. Since the Reformation and Renaissance, the prevailing view of the human being in modern culture has been that of, in quotes, economic man. And rulers have been those with economic power. You can trace this clearly in history. If you go further back in history to ancient times, even to the era I spoke of as Luciferic in character, the rulers were initiates. The Egyptian pharaohs, the Babylonian rulers, the rulers of Asia were initiates. Then the era of priests emerged, of priest kings, and they were dominant, basically, until the Reformation and Renaissance. Since then, economic man holds sway, and rulers are only the agents of economic factors. We must not think that modern rulers are anything other than the agents of economic man. And all the laws that have been created, it is worth studying this carefully, are simply a consequence of what economists have thought. Not until the 19th century do we see banking ideas and bankers replacing economic factors, and only then is the whole social order created which overlays and hides all other social conditions, by means, really, of the money economy. It is just a question of seeing these things clearly and tracing them in an empirical, phenomenological way. Everything I said in my second public lecture here is profoundly true. We should study all the details of these things, and if we do so, we'll discover them to be thoroughly true. Specifically, as the dominance of a mere, quote, symbol for genuine goods, close quote, emerged, a major Ahrimanic deception surfaced with it. If we do not understand that we must counter economic man and the economic order established by bankers with the legislative state and the spiritual organism of society, Ahriman will once again find in this failure of perception a substantial means to prepare the triumph of his incarnation, which is certainly underway and will arrive. These are the kinds of means Ahriman can use, drawing on a certain type of person. However, there is also another type, though often both types are present in one and the same person, who helps to smooth his triumphant progress. You see, complete errors in real life are not actually as harmful as half and quarter truths. Things completely mistaken soon become apparent, while half and quarter truths seduce people. They live with them, and these partial truths worm their way into life and have the most devastating effects. There are people who do not recognize that the worldview of Galileo and Copernicus are partial truths, do not perceive their illusory nature, or find it too arduous to engage with them at all. We have shown already how misguided this is. But there are also people today, a great many of them, who acknowledge a certain half-truth, a very important one, and refuse to recognize that it is only true within certain limits. Just as it is partial and one-sided to acknowledge the world only as Galileo and Copernicus describe it, or, more generally, in terms of academic disciplines of a materialistic kind, so it is likewise one-sided to acknowledge the world only as it is presented in the Gospels, and to refuse any other approach to truth and reality. The Gospels were, of course, given to those who lived in the first centuries of Christianity. To believe, today, that the Gospels can give us the whole of Christianity is a half-truth, and therefore one that continually befuddles people, offering Ahriman the best means to achieve the goal, the triumphant conquest of his incarnation. There are a great many people nowadays who believe they are speaking in Christian humility when they say that they have no need of spiritual science. In fact, this is terrible arrogance. The simplicity and plain speaking of the Gospels, they say, leads them to the eternal truths humankind needs. It is usually actually real arrogance that comes to expression in such seeming humility, and this proves very useful to Ahriman in the way I have suggested. Please do not forget what I said at the start of today's reflections, that at the time when the Gospels were written, people's thinking, feeling, and vision, their whole way of seeing things, was imbued with a Luciferic quality. They were able to grasp the Gospels in terms of a kind of Luciferic gnosis. But nowadays, we can no longer grasp the Gospels in this ancient way. To hammer on about the Gospels as they have been handed down to us will no longer give us a real comprehension of Christ. A true view of Christ is in fact nowhere less forthcoming than in the diverse religious confessions. For us to come to a real understanding of Christ today, the Gospels need to be deepened through spiritual science. Here, it is interesting to study the separate Gospels carefully and fathom their true content. But just to take the Gospels at face value, as many people are nowadays taught to do, is not a path toward Christ, but a path away from Him. This is why the confessions are drifting ever further away from Christ. What view of Christ is found by someone who takes the Gospels at face value without deepening them through spiritual science? If he does really study the Gospels, he will ultimately arrive at a form of Christ, but one that falls far short of the reality, to which only spiritual science can lead us. The Gospels as they are lead to a correct view of Christ in a sense, yet this is only a kind of hallucination, a picture or vision if you like, albeit a real inner one, but no more than a picture. We do not find Christ's reality by this means. And this is precisely the reason why modern theology has become so materialistic. Those who study the Gospels merely as theology arrive at the view that what can be gained from them is more or less the same as the conclusion they draw from Paul's Damascene experience. Wishing to establish Christianity, yet in fact undermining it, they state that Paul was sick, mentally ill, and this was why he had his vision at Damascus. The Gospels alone only enable us to form an hallucination, a vision. Through them we can gain an inwardly true picture, but not the reality of Christ. To reach the real Christ, we have to fathom everything that we can today gain from spirit knowledge of the world. This is why those who reject any kind of true spiritual knowledge and perception, and in their sectarian confessions hammer on the truth of the Gospels alone, are already forming the beginnings of a flock for Ahriman, when he appears in human form within modern civilization. They reject all spiritual exertions that lead to detailed and tangible perception, and their circles will therefore produce hosts of adherents to Ahriman's cause. These things are developing and are at work amongst modern humanity. Someone who speaks to humankind today, whether of social questions or other matters, with knowledge of initiation science, is speaking in this context and addressing this situation. He knows where the adversarial powers are at work, that they dwell above all in the supersensible realm, and that human beings, poor souls, are succumbing to them, are being led astray. His appeal to humanity will therefore be this: let us try to free ourselves from the grave temptations that seek to enlist us in establishing and consolidating the triumph of Ahriman. There are many who feel something along these lines, but there is not yet enough courage to fully engage, as anthroposophic spiritual science must, with Christ and the historical impulses of Lucifer and Ahriman in the thorough way that is needed. People sense the need for this, but they hold back from going far enough. Where today can we find recognition of the need to penetrate worldly, materialistic science and its Ahrimanic character with the Christ impulse? And on the other hand, to illumine the Gospels through spiritual scientific insights. How many people are really working to do both the one and the other through true spiritual scientific endeavors? Yet humanity will only gain the right stance toward Ahriman's earthly incarnation by comprehending these things. At the same time, finding the courage, will, and energy to shine the Spirit into worldly science and to illumine the Gospels with this same Spirit. Otherwise, only half-truths will emerge. Think, for instance, of an enlightened figure such as Cardinal Neumann, who had clear vision of modern religious developments. When he was invested as cardinal in Rome, he openly stated in his address that to survive into the future, Christian Catholic teachings would need a new revelation. But we do not need a new revelation, for the age of revelations in the old sense has passed. Instead, we need a new science that is illumined by the Spirit. But people need the courage to engage with this new science. Think, for instance, of a literary series such as titled Lux Mundi, around the end of the 1880s, the beginning of the 1890s. Certain members of the English High Church, renowned theologians that belonged to it, sought to build bridges between worldly disciplines and religious dogma. But this amounted only to a tentative, tenuous effort rather than a keen grasp of worldly science, a real illumining of it by the Spirit, an open-minded study of the Gospels. Nowhere was it clearly stated that the Gospels alone are no longer enough, that they need illumining and clarifying. But that is what modern humanity needs, a two-pronged courage that says worldly science alone leads to illusion, and the Gospels alone lead to hallucination. We will only find a middle way between illusion and hallucination in a real, spiritually informed grasp of reality. That is what counts. It is important to penetrate these things with understanding. A merely worldly science would sow nothing but illusion amongst humanity, and would lead people eventually to accomplish nothing but idiocies. There is already enough stupidity in the world. The Great War was surely a great stupidity. Many of those involved in it were imbued with the outlooks of modern science. And if you look at the curious symptoms that appear when, for instance, some sect or other places unique emphasis on one of the four Gospels alone, you will more easily understand what I have said today about the Gospels. A sect that hearkens only to the Gospel of St. John, or another that does the same with the Gospel of St. Luke, tends strongly, as you can discover, to all kinds of hallucinatory symptoms. The one-sided nature of each Gospel, thank goodness, has not yet sown calamity, because there are four Gospels which outwardly contradict each other. Because there are four Gospels, people cannot succumb to the direction of one alone, cannot be drawn exclusively in that direction. One Sunday a priest will read from one of them, the next from another, and this mitigates the effect of each, complementing and modifying it with that of the others. There is great wisdom in the fact that these 4 Gospels have come down to us, so that, unlike many adherents of sects, we do not succumb to a single current that would overwhelm us if we studied only one Gospel alone. If we allow only one of the Gospels to work upon us, it becomes especially evident that this will ultimately lead to hallucinatory symptoms. Yes, we have to shed a good deal of our subjective inclinations, a good deal of what we feel naturally drawn to, which we consider to be pious or clever. Of primary importance today is for us to develop an all-round sense of the truth, and for this, courage is required. That is what I wished to say to you today, so that you can realize that what we are trying to achieve within humanity does not have much deeper roots than merely subjective inclinations or prejudice. It is read from the signs of the times as something that must be undertaken. It has been a relatively long time since we met together here, and I was very concerned today to say what I now have. I hope that we will have a further opportunity to speak about such things again in the not-too-distant future. Humanity's current stage of evolution bears a particular character, and of course we can say that every age marks the beginning of an evolutionary phase, but then we must characterize its nature. The character of this new phase into which we are now entering is one which, into the far future of the earth, will inevitably bring humanity an experience of decline and descent in the physical world, a reversal, a retrograde development. We have already passed the time when humanity advanced by virtue of ever more refined physical powers. In forthcoming times, humanity will still advance, but only through a spiritual evolution that raises itself above the processes of the physical plane. Physical processes will no longer bring satisfaction to those who wish only to give themselves up to them. In the context of our spiritual science, we have long since indicated, as described in the lecture cycle on the Apocalypse, that humanity is heading toward a, quote, war of all against all, close quote. And from now onward, this is something that should be taken very, very seriously. It should not remain a merely theoretical truth for people, but must come to expression in their actions and whole conduct. The very fact that, to put it trivially, people will gain little pleasure from their evolution on the physical plane in future will increasingly lead them to see that further evolution must instead emerge from spiritual powers. We will only be able to gain full understanding of these things if we consider a broad span of humanity's evolution and apply the lessons we learn from this to what humankind will increasingly encounter in future. Then we can see what aims are at work in humanity, coming to expression in rhythmically recurring war and devastation, of which the present catastrophe is only a beginning. It would be very short-sighted to think that this catastrophic war will lead in some way to lasting peace enjoyed by humanity on the physical plane. This will not be so. What has to come on earth is spiritual development. And we can see its spirit, its direction and meaning, if we survey a relatively long span of time preceding the mystery of Golgotha, then consider something of the meaning of the mystery of Golgotha itself, and subsequently try to spiritually trace the further effects of the mystery of Golgotha in humanity's future evolution. We have considered the mystery of Golgotha from the most varied angles, and today I would like to add another perspective by describing something of the character of human civilization preceding the mystery of Golgotha, going back, say, to the 3rd millennium before Christ, and tracing a quality that lasted into the Christian era, and which, as you know, is referred to as heathen culture. Within this heathen culture, like an oasis, arose a very different Hebraic culture, that of the Jewish people. And from this, in turn, Christianity emerged. We can understand heathen culture if we are clear that it was one, basically, whose knowledge, vision, and actions drew on more comprehensive powers than earthly ones. We can say that the Hebraic Judaic culture is what really first inoculated humankind with the moral element, which had no distinct existence in heathen culture. Instead, though, this ancient heathen culture was such that the human being felt himself to be embedded in the whole cosmos. This is something of which we should take particular note. The human being, as a participant in ancient heathen culture on earth, felt himself to be part of the whole cosmos. He felt how the powers at work in the course of the stars continued on into his own actions, or more accurately, continued in the powers at work in his own actions. The study of astrology, as it later developed and as it survived into our own times, is only a pale reflection, and really a very misleading one, of this ancient wisdom that was drawn down from the course of the stars, and which, at the same time, dictated human actions. We only properly understand these ancient cultures if, from the perspective of spiritual science, we shed a little light on the outward course of human evolution in the 4th and 5th centuries BC. In speaking of the 2nd and 1st post-Atlantean eras, and picturing human life on earth then, during the 5th, 6th, and 7th millennia BC, we must avoid thinking of it in terms that too closely resemble our own existence today. In these ancient times, people on earth possessed a kind of instinctive soul life that in some respects was closer to the soul life of animals than to our inner experience today. But it would be a very narrow way of seeing things to say merely that people were more animal-like in those times. The human beings on earth in those early times were certainly more animal-like in their state of soul. But these animal bodies of humankind were used by spirit-soul beings, and therefore felt themselves to be very much part of supersensible and above all cosmic worlds. If we look back far enough to around the 5th millennium BC, human beings did not feel themselves so much to be inhabiting their animal bodies, but experienced the latter more as instruments. If we wish to characterize these humans more precisely, we must say that when they were awake, they did wander around with an instinctive soul life like animals, but into this instinctive soul life shone something like dreams from their sleeping state, something like waking dreams. In these waking dreams they saw how they had descended into their animal bodies, but only to use them. The real nature of inner soul experience at that time passed down as a vision and rite to Mithraic rituals and worship, whose chief symbol is the god Mithras, riding upon a bull. Above the starry heavens to which he belongs, and below the earthly realm to which the bull belongs. This was not really a symbol for these ancient people, but a vision of their reality. A person had this inner experience. Outside my body during the night, I belong to the powers of the cosmos and the starry heavens. On awakening in the morning, I employ the animal instincts in an animal body. Then, a kind of twilight shrouded humanity's evolution. The life of humankind became somewhat duller and more obtuse as the cosmic dreams receded and instinctual life gained the upper hand. The earlier soul state of human beings was preserved within the mysteries, principally those of Asia. But humanity in general, insofar as it did not participate in mystery wisdom, lived in a more or less dull twilight condition during the fourth and beginning of the third millennium. We can say that at this period, the fourth and beginning of the third millennium BC, a diffuse and twilight soul life existed across Asia and the known world of the time, an instinctive life of soul. But the mysteries existed, and their rites and ceremonies actively enabled the worlds of spirit to flow into human life, thus continuing to illumine human beings by these means. But now, at the beginning of the third millennium BC, something very significant occurred. In characterizing this twilight and more instinctual life of humankind, at the same time we can say that the human being's soul, spiritual entelechy was not yet able to make use of intrinsically human organs of understanding and thinking. These organs were already there, had been developed in the human being's physical organism, but his soul spiritual being could not yet employ them. Thus people could not as yet gain knowledge through their thinking or powers of judgment. Instead, they could only gain what was given them through the mysteries. But now, around the beginning of the third millennium BC, a significant event occurred in the East. Without resistance, a child grew up in one of the wealthy families, connected with the rites and ceremonies of the Asiatic mysteries of the time. Circumstances were such that this child was permitted to participate in these ceremonies, no doubt because the priests in charge of the mysteries felt something inspiring them to allow this to such a child. When the person living in this child had grown to be about 40, something remarkable occurred, and it has to be said that the mystery priests, in a sense, had a prophetic vision that this would happen. Around the age of 40, this person who had grown up within the mysteries of Eastern Asia suddenly began to grasp, by means of human powers of judgment, the meaning of what had formerly only entered the mysteries through revelation. He was, more or less, the first who might employ the organs of human understanding in this way, and only in relation to the mysteries. If we translate into our modern language what the priests of the mysteries said about this, we would put it like this: no less a being than Lucifer himself was incarnated in this human being. It is highly significant that in the third millennium BC, in Eastern Asia, Lucifer actually incarnated in the flesh in a real sense. This individual, Lucifer incarnate in the flesh, who also then taught others, was the origin of what we now regard as pre-Christian heathen culture, and lived too in the gnosis of the early Christian centuries. It would be quite wrong to speak in a derogatory way of this Lucifer culture. The beauty that emerged from Greek culture, its philosophical insights, everything at work in ancient Greek philosophy and the tragedies of Aeschylus, would not have been possible without this incarnation of Lucifer. As I said, the power and influence of this incarnation worked on also in southern Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia in the early Christian centuries. And after the mystery of Golgotha had occurred on earth, it was understood largely through this Luciferic wisdom. The gnosis, by means of which the mystery of Golgotha could initially be grasped, was certainly informed and made fruitful by Luciferic wisdom. This is what we must stress to begin with, that at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, Lucifer incarnated in China. Then, at the beginning of our era, Christ incarnated, and initially, this incarnation of Christ was understood by virtue of the still present power of that ancient Lucifer incarnation. This power faded from human insight, as a human capacity, during the 4th century AD. And yet it continued to have its after effects, its reverberations. And now, in a not too distant future, these two incarnations, that of Lucifer in ancient times, and the incarnation of Christ, which gives earth evolution its intrinsic meaning, will be joined by a third. Current events are in large measure preparing this third incarnation. The incarnation of Lucifer in the 3rd millennium BC endowed humankind with the capacity to employ the organs of his thinking, reason, and judgment. It was Lucifer himself in a human body who first grasped, through rational judgment, what formerly could only enter humankind through revelation, the meaning of the mysteries. And what is now being prepared, and will quite certainly occur on earth in the not too distant future, is an actual incarnation of Ahriman. Since the middle of the 15th century, as you know, we have been living in an age when human beings should increasingly come into possession of their full power of awareness. This must be a very significant fact as we approach Ahriman's incarnation, that we do so with full awareness. The incarnation of Lucifer was prophetically perceived only by the mystery priests, and the Christ incarnation, through the event at Golgotha, was something that remained very largely unconscious to human beings. Now, though, humanity must look consciously toward the approaching incarnation of Ahriman, which will bring with it many traumas on the physical plane. In the ongoing wars and disasters of the near future, the human spirit will become very inventive in the domain of physical life. This will inevitably happen, and there is nothing that can be done to avoid it. And this inventiveness will make it possible for Ahriman to incarnate within a bodily human individual. This Ahrimanic potency is preparing its incarnation on earth from the world of spirit. It seeks to prepare this coming incarnation, thus of Ahriman in human form, in a way that will, as far as possible, enable him to tempt and seduce human beings on earth. As civilization develops in the forthcoming period, our task will be to live with full awareness of the approaching Ahriman incarnation. Then this incarnation of Ahriman can serve humanity through our cultivation of a higher spiritual evolution, so that we become aware, specifically through Ahriman, of what we can attain, or rather not attain, through merely physical existence. We must live consciously toward this approaching Ahriman incarnation, becoming more conscious in all areas of life, increasingly perceiving what currents in life are drawn toward this incarnation. Through spiritual science, people must learn to interpret life so that they perceive and learn to master the currents drawn into the vortex of Ahriman's incarnation. They must know that Ahriman will live amidst humanity on earth, but that people can meet him with courage and themselves determine what they can learn from him, what they wish to absorb and accept from him. Yet they will not be able to do this if they do not start now to take the reins of certain spiritual or unspiritual currents which Ahriman will otherwise employ to leave human beings as unaware as possible of his arrival. Then he would appear on earth and in a sense overwhelm, tempt, and seduce human beings, so that they deny earthly evolution and prevent it from reaching its goal. We have to acquaint ourselves with certain spiritual and unspiritual currents if we wish to understand the whole process I have spoken of here. It is apparent, isn't it, that today increasing numbers of people wish to know nothing about a science of the spirit, about spiritual perception. The old powers of religion, it is clear, no longer act as inner impulse for a great many people. Whether they still attend church or not is no longer of any account to many, for the old powers, once active in religion, are now devoid of inner meaning for them. But neither do they resolve to encompass the new spiritual life that can flow into our culture. They resist this, reject it, regard it as foolishness, as something they find uncomfortable. They do not engage with it, but actually, of course, the human being living on earth is a unity, and we cannot sunder our spirit from our physical body. Between birth and death they act as one. And if we do not inwardly take up spirit, the spirit is still there, nevertheless. Since the last third of the 19th century, the spiritual element flows everywhere around us, streams into earthly evolution. And one can say that the spirit is there, but that people just do not wish to absorb it. Even if they do not wish to accept the spirit, it is there nevertheless. It is there. And what happens to this spirit? As paradoxical as it may sound, for much that is true, very true, appears paradoxical to people today. The spirit unconsciously flows into the people who reject or dismiss it. People eat and drink. Perhaps those who reject the spirit eat and drink with the greatest gusto. And the spirit flows into the processes of eating and digestion. That is the secret of the path into materialism that began to gather strength around 1840, or rather started to be prepared then. Those who do not absorb spirit through their soul do still absorb it through eating and drinking. They eat and drink the spirit. They are soul and spirit eaters. And in this way the spirit, flowing into earth evolution, passes into the Luciferic element, is conveyed, communicated to Lucifer. By this means the Luciferic power grows ever stronger, and can then help the Ahrimanic power in preparing its incarnation. Human beings must become aware of this. Those at least who are willing to acknowledge that in future people will either absorb spirit knowledge or instead unconsciously consume the spirit and thereby pass it to the Luciferic powers. This stream of spirit and soul consumption is especially supportive to Ahriman, because he can increasingly lull people asleep in consequence. When he incarnates, he will then appear amongst human beings in a way that overwhelms them and prevents them consciously encountering him. But besides this, Ahriman can directly prepare his incarnation, and is doing so. People today have a life of the spirit, a life of the mind, but a purely intellectual one that does not refer or relate to the world of spirit. This merely intellectual life is spreading amongst humankind increasingly. It first took root in academic life and science, but is now also leading to all kinds of social aberrations in society. What is the nature of this intellectual life? It has so little to do with the real interests of human beings. Let me ask you this: how many professors or teachers are there today in centers of learning, schools and universities, who show no real inner enthusiasm for their subject, but pursue it simply as a career? The soul's immediate interest does not connect with the study or work undertaken in these places. This even affects children's learning. Just think how much people learn and absorb at various stages of life without having any real interest or enthusiasm in this learning. How superficial and external intellectual life becomes for many who dedicate themselves to it. Think how many people are hard at work producing all sorts of intellectual content that is then preserved in archives and libraries, but has no spiritual life. All this intellectual life of the mind, infused with no glowing warmth of soul, devoid of human enthusiasm, directly supports the incarnation of Ahriman and its intrinsic meaning. This lulls people asleep in the way I have described and can greatly benefit Ahriman. Alongside this, there are many other currents in spiritual or unspiritual life that Ahriman can employ if human beings do not themselves use them in the right way. In recent times it has been trumpeted abroad, and is still being proclaimed, that nation-states should be established, national realms. One hears a great deal about the, quote, self-determination of nations, close quote, and yet the time when kingdoms were founded based on blood and race is over now, has no more part to play in our evolution. When people appeal to distinctions of race and nation, which do not arise from the intellect or spirit, this cultivates disharmony amongst humankind. Such disharmony is something the Ahrimanic power can very especially use. National chauvinism, distorted patriotism, will provide the material for Ahriman to forge the conditions he seeks. As well as this, all kinds of party political views are aired today. These partisan views and opinions produce a kind of smokescreen that obscures the gaze for many who do not even wish to see things clearly. Nowadays it is possible to prove anything, even the most radical statements, with great ingenuity. One can prove the truth of Leninism with ingenious arguments, but the opposite can equally well be proven, as well as everything that lies between two such extreme positions. The value of any partisan political program, and its very reverse, can be proven most rigorously. Both will be right in terms of their arguments. The intellectual spirit that holds sway today is nowhere near adequate for demonstrating whether something has inner vitality and inner value for life. It proves things, backs them up with evidence. But what is thus proven may still be very far removed from having any intrinsic value or vitality. Nowadays, therefore, people hold fast to their contrary opinions, their conflicting partisan views, since every such view can be asserted intellectually with equal validity. The nature of the modern intellect is to remain superficial in its grasp of things, rather than penetrating below the surface to where reality prevails. People need only recognize this fully and thoroughly. They love staying on the surface with their rational outlook, rather than penetrating more deeply into other strata of existence in a way that actually corresponds to reality. To confirm this, one need only look around a little. Even the most superficial glance can show that what human beings love today so easily deceives them. They love numerical values in science, and also in their study of social conditions. Take a look at socialist literature. It is almost entirely composed of statistics, or in other words, numbers, and these are used to resolve and investigate the most important aspects of life. Using numbers, anything and everything can be proven, and people can be persuaded of anything. Actually, numbers used in this way are not a means to prove anything, but a way of deceiving people. One can be most deceived the moment one no longer looks through and beyond numbers to perceive qualities and realities. Here is one apt example. There has been much dispute about the nationality of the Macedonian people. A great deal in the politics of the Balkan Peninsula relied on the statistical evidence compiled about it. The numbers involved here are as relevant as the numbers used in other statistics. Whether one is studying wheat and rye statistics or the number of people of Greek, Serbian, and Bulgarian nationality who live in Macedonia, what statistics can prove is all much of a muchness. Numbers are quoted from the Greek, Serbian, and Bulgarian population, and fine conclusions can be drawn from these figures. Or, alternatively, one can look beyond them and see what is really going on. And this will reveal, for instance, that in any Macedonian family, the father may be said to be Greek, while one son is recorded as a Bulgarian and another as a Serbian. How this happens is something you can try to imagine. Such statistics are compiled and quoted in different ways to support different partisan views. And that is all that these statistics are good for. It is obvious that if a father is Greek, then both his sons will be too. This is just an example of how the figures are massaged and how numbers are distorted to serve particular ends. Numbers are an element that most help Ahriman to achieve his ends when they are cited as proof and evidence. A further means that Ahriman can employ is one which is not likely to be immediately recognized as such. It will sound paradoxical. As you know, we have tried to study the Gospels more deeply in our spiritual scientific movement. But this deepening of our understanding of the Gospels, something really increasingly necessary in our time, is dismissed by a great many people, just as they reject spiritual science. People who often think, or at least state, that they are humble are in fact the most arrogant. Increasingly, it is said one should take the simple message of the Gospels at face value rather than, say, studying the mystery of Golgotha in the complex ways that spiritual science proposes. Those who say that they are humble in their search for truth in the Gospels are actually the most arrogant, since they disdain honest and authentic inquiry through spiritual scientific insights. They are so proud that without actually exerting themselves, and simply through naive engagement with the Gospels, they believe they can grasp the highest knowledge of the world of spirit. What nowadays appears to be simple and humble often clothes the greatest arrogance. The proudest and most arrogant people can be found in sectarian religious confessions. You see, the Gospels arose at a time when Luciferic wisdom still existed. In the early Christian centuries, people understood the Gospels in a quite different way from later on. Today, those who cannot draw on spiritual science to deepen their understanding merely feign understanding of the Gospels. In reality, they do not even know the original meaning of the words written there. The translations into various different languages do not give us the truth of the Gospels. These translations are basically no longer even faintly reminiscent of the original meaning of the words in which the Gospels were first written. Only through spiritual science can we gain real insight into the intervention of the Christ being in earthly evolution. Those who take the, quote, simple message of the Gospels, close quote, at face value, as it is often stated, do not succeed in inwardly comprehending the Christ being, but arrive only at an illusion, or at the very most, a vision or hallucination of this Christ being. Making a real connection with the Christ being is no longer possible nowadays by merely reading the Gospels. All one gains by this means is a kind of subtle hallucination of Christ. This is why there is such a widespread theological view that the Christ did not indwell the man Jesus of Nazareth at all, but that the latter was just an historical individual like Socrates or Plato, the, quote, simple man from Nazareth, close quote, has in fact become the ideal of theologians. And very few of them, of course, know what to make of Paul's vision at Damascus. It is regarded as an hallucination, since, without spiritual scientific insights, people cannot come to a vision of the true Christ. The Gospels have to be deepened through spiritual science. You see, drawing to the very greatest degree on the dullness that overcomes those who wish to live only within the narrow confines of their confessions, Ahriman will seek to reach his goal, that of overwhelming and stupefying humankind through his incarnation. Those who think they are the most Christian because they dismiss any further development of views about the Christ mystery are actually the ones who will most further Ahriman's ends through their pride and arrogance. The religious sects and confessions are a breeding ground for Ahriman. There is no use in deluding ourselves about these things. Just as Ahriman's cause is furthered by the materialistic outlook, which dismisses everything spiritual and seeks to make a person into only what he eats and drinks, so his cause, not that of humanity, is furthered too by a rigid refusal of all spirit and a clinging to the literal words, the simple view, as people often say, of the Gospels. You see, to prevent people becoming too narrowly constricted by an individual gospel, the event of Golgotha is described from 4 different, only seemingly, contradictory perspectives in the 4 Gospels. This means that as long as people reflect just a little, they will be protected from too literal a view. But in the sects which base everything on just one of the 4 Gospels, there are actually a good many of them, full rein is given to the seductive, dulling, hallucinatory element that is induced by mere study of their words. At the time they were given, they had to act as a counterweight to the Luciferic gnosis. But if they are now taken as they were given, they do not serve human progress, but further the aims of Ahriman. Nothing is absolutely good in itself, but always only good or bad, depending on what use is made of it. The best can be the worst if people do not use it in the right way. The loftiest qualities of the gospel can have the most harmful effect if people are too self-satisfied to penetrate to a real spiritual scientific interpretation of these gospels. A great deal in the spiritual and unspiritual streams of today would necessitate people taking a clear view of it and adapting their inner conduct accordingly. Whether or not human beings wish to penetrate these things with their understanding will dictate how Ahriman's incarnation affects them, whether it induces them to completely lose their earthly goal, or whether this incarnation of Ahriman can make them recognize that intellectual life alone, unspiritual life, is of very limited importance. If human beings take in hand in the right way what I described as streams leading inexorably toward Ahriman, then simply through the incarnation of Ahriman in earthly existence, they will recognize clearly what is Ahrimanic on the one hand, as well as its polar opposite, the Luciferic. And then, through discerning the contrast between the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic, they will become able inwardly to encompass the third, reconciling and combining element. Humankind needs to wrestle its way through to this trinity of Christ, Ahriman, and Lucifer, for without this, people of the future will not be able to progress in a way that can really fulfill their earthly goal. Things connected with the science of the Spirit can really only be properly understood if one takes them fully seriously. Spiritual science is not something that seeks to inform humanity today with some kind of sectarian spirit, but is truly read from the needs of humanity's evolution. If we recognize these needs, we cannot just choose to engage or not engage with it, but will see that all of human life, both physical and spiritual, must be illumined and pervaded by a spiritual scientific perspective. Just as there was once a Luciferic incarnation in the East, and then a Christ incarnation at the midpoint, as it were, of world evolution, so an incarnation of Ahriman will take place in the West. This Ahriman incarnation should not be avoided. It must come, for human beings have to look Ahriman squarely in the face, if you like. He will be the individuality who shows humankind the enormous shrewdness and acuity it can develop by calling on the earth forces that support and cultivate this acuity. In the distress and hardships I spoke of, that will come upon human beings in the near future, they will grow very inventive. Much will be discovered in the forces and substances of the world to provide food for human beings. But these discoveries will also show how matter is connected with the organs of reason, not of the spirit, but reason. People will learn what one must eat and drink to become very clever and astute. One cannot become spiritual through eating and drinking, but very astute and clever. As yet, people are unaware of such things. Rather than only seeking them, though, these things will arise by themselves, through the hardships that will arise in the near future. By means of certain uses to which this knowledge will be put, secret societies that already exist and are making their preparations will pave the way for conditions that will enable the incarnation of Ahriman to occur on earth in the right way. And this incarnation should happen. For during our earthly evolution, we ought also to recognize how much can emerge from purely material processes. At the same time, though, we must come to see how we can master the spiritual or unspiritual streams that lead us toward Ahriman. When we realize that two conflicting political programs can be proven to be equally beneficial, then we will understand that proof is not what is needed, but a soul mood in which we experience living realities. What we experience in this way is different in kind from merely rational proof. Likewise, we will realize that the Gospels must increasingly be deepened through spiritual science. Taking the Gospels literally at face value furthers Ahrimanic culture. For purely external reasons, we can understand that people today will no longer get anywhere by taking the Gospels literally. As you know, what is right for a particular period is no longer right for another. What is right at one time becomes Luciferic or Ahrimanic at another. There was a time when reading the Gospels was enough. Today we must draw on the Gospels in a different way as we seek for spiritual knowledge of the mystery of Golgotha. Many people today certainly find it extremely uncomfortable to recognize such things. But if you have an interest in anthroposophy, you should truly try to discern how strata of culture have gradually come to lie adjacent to each other, causing a chaos into which light must be shown once more. One should try to read or listen to what some very radical modern person has to say about a particular issue of contemporary life, and compare it with the sermon, say, of a priest still wholly rooted in the mode of thinking and thought forms of older times. Then you really do find yourself confronted by two different worlds, which you can only reconcile by avoiding clear-sighted scrutiny of the truth. Listen to a modern socialist speak about the social question, and then listen, say, to a Catholic spokesman on the same subject. It is very interesting to see how two distinct strata of culture live side by side, using words in quite different ways. A word used in one way by one of them has a quite different meaning for the other. We should examine these things, illumine them with the light we can find if we give serious attention to reflections such as those we have sought to engage in today. In the end, people belonging to the positive religious confessions feel a kind of longing for religious deepening. It is by no means unimportant that such an outstanding mind, a positive Catholic spirit, such as Cardinal Neumann, said when he was invested as cardinal in Rome that he saw no way forward for Christianity without a new revelation. Yes, Cardinal Neumann said this. He could see no salvation for Christianity without a new revelation. But of course, he did not have the courage to give serious credence to a new spiritual revelation, and the same is true of the others. There are countless pamphlets published today about what humanity needs, let us say in relation to social conditions. Another has just appeared entitled Socialism, written by Robert Wilbrandt, the son of the poet Wilbrandt. In it he raises the social question, and clearly has a good foundation of detailed knowledge of the field. His conclusion is this: nothing will work without the Spirit, and the course things are now taking shows this need for the Spirit. But where does such a person get with this? He utters the word Spirit as an abstract concept, yet dismisses anything that really seeks to elaborate it. Digging around in abstractions, however much they go on about the Spirit, is not yet spiritual. We ought not to confuse dull, abstract talk of Spirit with a real positive search for the content of the world of Spirit, a search in which anthroposophically oriented spiritual science should engage. Many people today speak about the Spirit, but you who absorb spiritual science should refuse to allow yourselves to be fooled by mere talk of Spirit. You should recognize that there is a difference between this vacuous talk and real accounts of the world of Spirit as we seek to present them based on anthroposophy. These describe the world of Spirit in as real a way as the physical world of the senses can be outwardly described. You should be aware of the difference between the one and the other, repeatedly remembering that abstract talk of Spirit is in fact a diversion from real spiritual inquiry, and that there are many people today who speak of the Spirit, but in doing so are distancing themselves ever further from it. Mere intellectual reference to the Spirit does not lead to the Spirit. What is intelligence, in fact? What is the content of our human intelligence? I can explain this best to you if I offer the following picture. There are many ladies present who will perhaps understand this still better. Imagine that you are standing in front of a mirror and looking into it. This image of yourself that the mirror gives you is not in fact anything real, but arises through the mirror's reflecting capacity. Now, all that you possess inwardly as intelligence, as intellectual content, is also only a mirror image. There is no reality in it. And just as the mirror image of you is only produced by the mirror, so what is reflected in you as intelligence is only called forth by the physical instrument of your body, by your brain. Just as you cannot touch or stroke yourself if you reach toward your mirror image, so neither can you grasp the Spirit if you turn only to the intellectual reflection, in which there is no Spirit. What the intelligence grasps, however acute it is, never contains the Spirit, but only the picture of it. You cannot experience the Spirit if you make do with mere intelligence. And the intelligence is so seductive because it offers a picture, a reflection of the Spirit, but not the Spirit itself. People think they do not need to make efforts to live their way into the Spirit because they believe they already possess it. though all they possess is a reflection. To distinguish this, the mere image of the spirit from the real spirit, is the task of an outlook that goes beyond mere theorizing and seeks to dwell truly in a positive vision of the spirit. That is what I wish to say to you today, to reinforce the seriousness that should imbue our whole stance toward a life of the spirit grasped through anthroposophy. Our real onward evolution into the future will depend on how modern humanity regards this. If what I have described today is regarded as it is at present by most people, then Ahriman will be a terrible guest when he comes. But if people can find the will to take up into their awareness the things we have considered today, to govern and direct them so that humanity finds freedom in its stance toward the Ahrimanic power, then, when Ahriman appears, humankind will learn exactly what it needs to through him. We'll see that through the earth, though the earth must decline and decay, humanity by this very means can raise itself above earthly existence. After we reach a certain age in physical life, our physical body degenerates. And if we are sensible, we do not complain about this, knowing that our soul is working its way toward a life that does not run parallel with this decline. In humanity lives something that is not one with the decline of the physical earth, which has already begun, but which will become ever more spiritual as the earth enters its physical decadence. Let us say this quite openly. The earth is growing decadent, declining, as does human life in relation to its physical form. But by this very means, let us find the strength to integrate into our civilization the immortal part of all earthly evolution that must emerge from humanity and live on as the earth moves toward its demise.